let's say that L cell releases that GLP-1 in the gut, it goes and does things in the pancreas, it does things everywhere, it gets to the brain, and there's GLP-1 receptors in these POMCs, and it tells the POMC, hey, turn on. Let's stop eating here because we got enough.
Dr. William Seeds, you are one of the world's leading experts when it comes down to all things peptides. And one of the areas that you are so strong in is the world of GLP-1 receptor agonists, which people obviously more commonly known as Semaglutide, Ozempic, Wegovy, whatever. So I want to go into some detail just in how these work, what they actually do in the body, like soup to nuts. Let's do a serious deep dive.
I would love to head that way. I'm very excited about this part of I think an increasingly growing field of cellular medicine where GLP-1s are here to stay. And in fact, I have a book that's coming out at the end of this quarter that I think people will find very exciting, that really goes into the mechanisms and the pathways and all the other things people need to realize the importance of these GLP-1s.
Yeah, well, let's dive into it because it's a lot more than just appetite suppression.
Oh my gosh, you got that right.
After today's video, I put a link down below for Thrive Market. That is a 30% off discount link plus a free gift. So 30% off your entire grocery order. The thing I like about Thrive Market is they're trying to help get gnarly processed foods out of people's fridge and out of people's pantries. So these are healthier for you options, better for you options, and the prices are highly, highly competitive. So a lot of times you're gonna find prices cheaper than the grocery store, and it's delivered directly to your doorstep. So when it comes to like recalibrating your pantry, Thrive Market really, really is solid. It's very helpful to be able to have all your grocery shopping at your fingertips so you're not stressed about finding the right things. You can search. You can do a quick search for gluten-free. You can do a search for paleo. You can do a search for sugar-free, for keto, for this, for that, all at your fingertips, and then it's delivered directly to your doorstep. But let's be real, we're all pinching some pennies. So the best thing about it is that 30% off discount link off your entire grocery order using that link down below. I use my Thrive box consistently. I'm always changing up stuff. I'm always getting a Thrive order coming in a couple times per month, and it helps save me a bunch of money, but it also gets me some really cool stuff that I otherwise wouldn't find at the grocery store. So check them out in the top line of the description underneath this video. Right out the gate, people understand the basic idea of it, but can you give just a general overview, sort of 500-foot aerial view of what a GLP-1 receptor agonist is doing?
Absolutely. So I think, everybody sees a GLP-1 as a weight loss drug or peptide. I see a GLP-1 receptor agonist as a redox agent that works on metabolism, and that is and understand, we make all these things we're talking about today, we make in our body. GLP-1s are made by L cells that are in the gut that respond to, basically when we eat food, GLP-1s are released by the L cells, and what they do is they start the mechanisms of how we metabolize, how the cell is flexible in deciding how it's going to use glucose, how it's going to use fatty acids, how it's going to use proteins. And that flexibility is the key to the kingdom of understanding health, disease, cancer, immune disease, neurodegenerative disease. It's all about redox. It's about the cell's efficiency. And if you realize that, you realize that these GLP-1s and their mechanisms, which I can talk about here in just a second, are incredibly crucial to maintaining that efficient state of the cell. And this is where it gets to be, where I get to be this, I'm like this evangelist for the cell. The cell is brilliant. If we think we're going to manipulate the cell to do the right things or what we think is right, we're all that's just stupid thinking. The cell's brilliant. It knows if we give it the right signaling and we provide it the right environment, it knows how to adapt to whatever is being thrown at the cell. So kind of think of it like this. I'm kind of setting up the preamble to bring in this GLP-1 and then talk about all of these things because they're all very relevant. In every day we wake up, the cell has to adapt to whatever is thrown at it. Just waking up, stress, exercise, food, the sleep you had the night before. The cell is adapting to that environment, and it has to be flexible. It has to know how to use the substrates we talked about, the fatty acids and the proteins, which are broken down to amino acids, and the carbohydrates. It needs to know how to or when to utilize those to efficiently provide the energy for the cell, specifically the mitochondria, and the cell signaling, which people don't really understand how important the mitochondria is in cell signaling, to maintain or to start the process of what the cell needs to adapt. Okay? So if we understand that, and then we understand as the cell gets revved up and it starts producing ATP and NAD, it starts making the signaling processes work. Well, it's revving up and it's creating reactive oxygen species. It's creating superoxides, peroxides, peroxynitrates, these things that are also signaling agents to create the cell to adapt, but they also can be bad things if that reactive oxygen species process continues to where the mitochondria can't also make the antioxidants it needs to keep that system in control. So you have this amazing system of how the cell can rev up, produce reactive oxygen species, and make some things happen with cell signaling, but at the same time, it has to keep that under control with making its own antioxidants like superoxide desmutase catalase, hemoxygenase 1, glutathione peroxidase, all these things that are so important that everybody out there is trying to supplement and make things happen when they may be like over-oxidizing, over-reducing. And I mean, I see so much craziness with supplementation that's just beyond where I think if people really understood how the cell has that under control, and the more you do to give that cell that process, you're going to help it. So getting back to GLP-1s. So GLP-1s have this, their function is to, recognize that there is a sensor for food. And so what is it doing? It's going to upregulate the process of this beta cell in the pancreas to release insulin. Okay? So that release of insulin's job is to make sure that the food, basically, let's just say glucose, is going to be brought into muscle, it's going to be brought into fat, it's going to be brought into the liver. So it's ensuring that insulin's working, and it's actually setting up the pathways to utilize that energy appropriately. Is that,
of course. Yep.
So in that fashion, it's working to, and what's that goal? That goal for insulin is basically to either in muscle to utilize that glucose right away or to store it as glycogen. Mm-hmm. And same thing in the liver, same thing in fat. It's to store if it's not going to be utilized. So this is where we can kind of take another step back to explain that the root cause of so many problems in our lifetime right now, of how we're seeing an increase in insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, and how that's leading to autoimmune disease, we're kind of finding out that dysregulation of glucose and insulin is leading to about every metabolic problem and immune problem and cancer. All these things can be brought back to not maintaining the redox or the oxidative stress, antioxidant aspect of a cell in homeostasis, right? To keep it even. So taking that, so are we following? Am I saying?
For sure. No, I mean, it's the same concept with, insulin being wrongly demonized in the sense that insulin's not the problem. It's, you have your insulin glucagon balance, you have all these different balances, and those are out of whack. Then it's a problem. Then it's a substrate utilization problem. It's not an insulin problem. The insulin problem is downstream of the other problem, right? It's not someone eating a carbohydrate is not the problem, right? It's the inability to be able to substrate switch, the inability to have that metabolic flexibility for the proper signaling to occur, for GLUT4 translocation to actually happen. And, so then we get into this world of like we demonize a certain food group, and I'm a pretty low carb guy anyway, so I like to demonize insulin, but I'm careful not to, right? So it's like when you look at the big picture, it's kind of funny with something like GLP-1, it's in a way, it's actually promoting an insulin response, but it's promoting it in the proper way.
Correct. And I love what you're saying. You're right. This is awesome. You're right on target with. So let me grab onto something you said here. So glucose. Let's get into this fun stuff here. So glucose. Just imagine this process of where glucose. It's the mitochondria's function is to make number one ATP and NAD. Okay, to make some energy and then also to do some cell signaling. So that mitochondria depends on glucose to go through glycolysis, and then oxidative phosphorylation, or Krebs cycle, then oxidative phosphorylation, which is this electron transport chain that basically finally produces with oxygen, it produces ATP and NAD. Well, that electron transport system we call the proton motive force is this incredible force process of moving electrons and protons to make ATP and NAD. If we just imagine if that system, and the other way that system works is that fat can be utilized through beta oxidation of fat to be used to go through the Krebs cycle and then the electron transport system to make ATP and NAD. So the cell uses both efficiently and actually fat is more efficient in energy production than glucose is. And it uses it maneuvers those substrates to keep the reactive oxygen species the best it can, but produce the highest amount of ATP and NAD with the most amount of oxygen it can utilize in that process. And it also uses proteins. That's a whole nother step, but proteins through the Krebs cycle and through oxidative phosphorylation to also make ATP and NAD. So if you can imagine if somebody when we talk about too many carbohydrates, or let's just talk about just too much food, maybe that's not being utilized correctly and they're getting too much glucose through the system, and that's setting up that electron transport system, that proton motive force, it gets revved up too much, right? Yep. And so it produces too many reactive oxygen species, and then the mitochondria can't keep up with its own antioxidant production, and so you start to get an imbalance in redox. And that slippery slope...
Yep. Then it taxes the liver, then it taxes... Yep.
What happens is you get into so the glucose is, if it's not being used for energy, what's going to happen? It's insulin's storing it as glycogen. Well, there can only be so much storage, and that what happens? Yeah. Well, then you're producing more insulin to try to utilize more of this glucose. And when we just talked about that process of reactive oxygen species getting out of place, well, those reactive oxygen species are having an inflammatory effect on the insulin receptors. And they're causing a downregulation of those insulin receptors so that they don't work in turning on the mechanisms of the PI3K, AKT, mTOR, all these pathways that are so important to cell survival, cell resilience. And if that resistance is starting, so that's how insulin resistance starts. It starts by stopping a process that is critical to maintaining cell function and beta cell mass in the pancreas, to where now you have to, now that beta cell has to work a little harder to make more insulin, right? And so making more insulin in that beta cell is doing what? More reactive oxygen species. So it's like a cycle. So now you're getting more inflammation, you're producing more insulin, but what is that insulin doing? That insulin is making the liver now and fat store even more glycogen, where it can't store any more as glycogen, so it goes into something called de novo liposynthesis. That de novo liposynthesis is a process of now making fat. And that's where we get into the problems of now this fat production, in particular in fat adipose tissue, in visceral around organs, and also subcutaneous, but more visceral, and in the liver, that fat production, that starts to get to where all of a sudden you start making more fat, more triglycerides, more VLDLs, and you get this backup of these fats that now these fats can become toxic. And so we call that lipotoxicity. So that lipotoxicity adds to the inflammatory state of all of these cells, adds to the insulin resistance, and hence you've got this progression of now an inflammatory state of where you start, things start getting attacked in the cell, the mitochondria, the DNA, the mitochondrial DNA, and that leads to further problems of epigenetic changes now, where you get chromatin repression, you get these things like when people talk about methylation, they talk about B vitamins and things, but it's so deep.
Yeah, no, now you've got a dysfunctional mitochondria that is going through its own rebirthing and its own process where basically you're replicating a dysfunctional mitochondria. So it becomes a vicious cycle that is on steroids, for lack of a better term.
Well, and so that you hit another point, and this is where we could go for days just on this, because you're right on top of things here. So the mitochondria has now lost its ability. So we've gotten in this state where what's the key to the mitochondria? It's being able to rebuild itself and do something called mitochondrial biogenesis, where it can increase itself. Why? Why is that important? Because the more mitochondria, the more use of oxygen, the more use of that energy, glucose, the more ATP, NAD, the more signaling, the better the redox state of the cell. When it loses that ability to go through mitochondrial biogenesis and it gets into this state of, we lose autophagy, but we lose something called mitophagy. And what you're talking about is you get into this fragmentation state, like mitochondria go through fission and fusion. And they get into this fragmentation state of fission, which is an inefficient state, but it's enough to keep things rolling, but it's a bad state. Yeah. And what we've kind of just described is we've described the whole, and it wants to be in fusion. It wants to be making bigger, longer mitochondria that are more productive to utilize more oxygen, to utilize the glucose and proteins and fatty acids that are at play to do what? To build muscle, to produce antioxidants, to keep the immune system strong. So what we've just gone through is we've gone through metabolic problems, we've gone through the potential of immune disease starting, we've gone through the potential of cancer starting, and we've also described aging. And all of these things can be related back to when we get into muscle building or talk about muscle, we can really talk about how all this makes sense. So the GLP-1s, they have pleiotropic pathways, like many pathways they work through. So number one is the GLP-1 works as it works through this molecular pathway. It's called a PKA, PI3K, AKT, meaning it's a pathway for survival, for resilience. So you're building back, you're giving that cell that adaptive quality again, right? It's truly doing that through one pathway. And then there's another pathway where it improves something called AMPK. AMPK is a catabolic state, mTOR is the anabolic state. It's like day and night. When you wake up, your circadian clock turns on, the salvage pathway of NAD turns on, and you're in this catabolic state to rebuild for the night. So you're breaking down, you're going through autophagy, through mitophagy, you're going through all these steps to get ready to rebuild. So it's like the house cleaning of the cells, but you're in an energy deprivation in the morning because you've slept all night, you fasted and so forth, and you've got to get ready to reboot, to rebuild, and rebuilding is at night. So that's the anabolic state. So you've got catabolism during the day, anabolism at night, and so that's AMPK. So AMPK is crucial to the cell being able to again adapt by rebuilding. And what do I mean by that? It means breaking down the bad cells, reorganizing and gathering amino acids and other important growth factors and peptides to rebuild the cells again. Because cells are always going through the cell cycle. They're always rebuilding. And so if we can reestablish, and that's something, unfortunately, when a disease state progresses, like insulin resistance, when we lose metabolic flexibility, what are we losing? We're losing that important aspect of AMPK's activation of autophagy, mitophagy, and actually it gets into that whole process I brought up before, mitochondrial biogenesis. Mitochondria have to rebuild themselves and they want more, and if we can get into the pathways, but it's all about that mitochondrial rebuilding also. So AMPK is vital, and you've lost some of those capabilities with this process of getting into the issues with being overweight. And let me just jump into one thing real quick. When people are overweight, even a moderate amount of being overweight, that fat tissue is inflammatory. And there's immune cells that are in that fat tissue that polarize it, become inflammatory. And so they're signaling and creating this other environmental issue of causing this reactive oxygen species problem that are leading to this insulin resistance that I've referred to. So we've talked about, I hope I'm not saying too much.
You're good. You're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we talked about the PKA pathway, the resilient pathway. We've talked about the AMPK, the autophagy pathway. When we talk about that cell resilient pathway, that PKA, PI3K, AKT, that also sets up the process of mTOR activation and actually the muscle protein synthesis, but also protein synthesis, which is necessary. And so and the reason I bring this up is that all these steps are there is that you hear a lot of shit out there about people not understanding how these GLP-1s they're saying that they're bad or they cause muscle loss. Well, let me tell you, anybody who goes on a diet, you're going to lose muscle, and we can talk about that too.
Yeah, if you look I've done videos on that where you actually compare. And they're not my favorite people in the world, but the Nadolsky brothers, are an example. Spencer and Scott, Nadolsky. They put some work out that really broke it down in a way that, I couldn't deny. It was like, okay, if you actually look at the rate of muscle loss in any accelerated weight loss, like whether it's just through extreme caloric deficit, it's actually somewhat metabolically and like musculoskeletally protective to have GLP-1 because you're talking about a little bit more of an efficient process where you're not catabolizing just for the sake of catabolizing. Anything that's actually broken down would actually be utilized rather than just expended.
Exactly.
If that makes sense.
Yes, it does, because what's being removed is inefficient muscle.
Correct. Yes.
Inefficient muscle. But that is going to be repurposed and reused. And you're making the muscle you have more efficient.
Yeah. And if you're metabolically functional, it's sort of like, we've talked about this in the case of fasting, because we talk about fasting a lot on this channel. It's like, okay, when you are activating mTOR via a mechanical pathway, like exercise, right?
Correct.
Exercise can still mTOR, mTORC1, still activate that via exercise, even if you're in a fasted state, right? So you're still building, even though you're calorically deprived. And the reason that that's happening is because the substrates that are circulating, hypothetically, maybe it's pulling it from fat in your calf tissue and synthesizing it into somewhere else, right? The point is that once mTOR is activated, substrates are pulling from other areas of your body and you're rebuilding and essentially reallocating. And when a system is healthy, that can occur. When a system is unhealthy, for lack of a better term, it's waste, right? So I would imagine that process doesn't work as well. So I think where people miss the boat, and this is exactly what you're alluding to with GLP-1s, is it's not just this magic injection that's making you eat less. It's revitalizing something at a very serious metabolic pathway that needs to be revitalized so that systems and processes are working. And if I might be, I might be wrong by saying this, but I would imagine that a lot of the satiety comes from the fact that now a person that has maybe gone decades with inadequate signaling is now all of a sudden getting proper signaling, and they're getting the appetite suppression they might ordinarily get if their system was working normally. And then some.
Yeah, and that's another great place to go with GLP-1s that maybe we should, can I expand into that a little bit?
Yeah, because I think where people, this is great, because I think where people are probably always trying to connect these dots of, okay, well, where's the appetite suppression come in?
Sure.
Where's the appetite suppression come in?
Sure.
And not for any wrong reason, it's just that's what's marketed, right? That's what's talked about. So this is great that people are getting an understanding of the metabolic overview, because I've talked to a lot of really well-established researchers in the academic community, and almost every single one has touted the benefits of a GLP-1 receptor agonist in almost all categories in the research world. It's not until you get into the internet world that you start seeing people bashing it, because I look at things from a research lens as much as I can, and most of the researchers are saying, actually, this is pretty fascinating stuff and it has a lot of promise.
Well, and there's also a difference. So I'm not only a cellular medicine geeky guy doing research about metabolic pathways. I've been using GLP-1s for over 10 years. I was teaching GLP-1s when people didn't know what GLP-1s were, for the exact reason what we're talking about here, about improving metabolism. And I mean, we've had if I get on the soapbox of the GLP-1s, we've had them around for a long time. It's just all of a sudden now people are recognizing that there is a place, or it's being. I think what happened is when GLP-1s went from we used to have to use them like twice a day injections, and then go to one. Then it went to once a day, and then in 2017, basically when the Semaglutide came out and was advertised as a once a week, that kind of changed the whole picture of where we could go with compliance and use something that people would be more amenable to, who weren't really at that stage of wanting to do something daily. But we learned so many things about GLP-1s, and I'm talking about practicing with them. I'm talking about making real changes with patients and making the mistakes, and learning from my patients how to use these effectively. And so that's why I get a little I get a little bent when I see people talking that are reading a piece of paper or claiming to be an expert. And by the way, I'm a practicing physician. I don't claim to be an expert. I hope I'm an educator, but I'm still learning. And when somebody just has to be an authority to talk about something like that and say something's bad, it's like, oh my gosh, this is not the right way to be going, because we have this incredible opportunity now to really change some lives. It's been phenomenal, actually. It's been humbling, and it's been incredibly fulfilling to be part of this patient journey, to see all these things that can potentially happen when you can use a GLP-1. Imagine this. You get somebody that comes in that doesn't know really much about exercise, doesn't know much about diet, doesn't know really how to be healthy, but knows they're in a place where they need to get healthier, and they come to you for weight loss maybe, right? But the first statement I make with patients is, look, weight loss is going to be a side effect. What we're going to do is make these cells efficient. I'm going to teach them about what we're doing. But the cool thing about GLP-1s is when you start to get those changes going for these patients, and they start to feel different. They see things happening. Their brain is more functional. They're feeling better. Their immune system's improving. All kinds of things that can happen. They start changing the conversation, and it's like, Dr. C's, what else can I do now? And then you're like, wow, this is awesome. The patient's engaged. And it's like, okay, here's where we start the real things, right? Exercise, diet, like the things that could be the most tremendous changes in their lives. This is just a tool, right? It's a tool to get us there. And so this is, I'm kind of parlaying this now into this appetite thing real quick for you. So leading into this appetite thing, appetite issue, this is great. Another place to go. Okay, so we've talked about how GLP-1s through one pathway can work on resilience, survival, so forth. We talked about it through another pathway, the AMPK pathway, how it can improve autophagy, mitophagy, catabolism. We've also talked how it can lead to mTOR. So let's kind of go into this appetite. So GLP-1 receptors are everywhere in the body, everywhere. Almost every cell, immune cells have GLP-1 receptors. And let's kind of go to the brain. So in the brain, we have GLP-1 receptors on particular neurons. We have them on microglial cells. We have them on astrocytes, and I can get into that later. But when we're talking about, let's talk about these people that get into this state of the beginning of insulin resistance and the loss of the metabolic efficiencies of getting glucose into the cell, and they're getting heavier, and they're gaining fat, and their appetite's increasing, and what they don't realize is that in the brain, in the hypothalamus, there's this POMC neuron. Basically, it's a POMC that is what is actually driven into an mTOR state. mTOR meaning it's just going. Just imagine every cell we want in a balanced AMPK, mTOR. We want it balanced. Well, because of this overactivation of glucose and continued process of and loss of flexibility of the cell, what happens in every cell basically is it gets more into an mTOR state because it's trying to store, it's trying to build. And so in the brain, in this POMC neuron that's in the, it's in the arcuate nucleus, well, actually the infundibular nucleus in a human. This is where this neuron sits, and it produces melanocyte stimulating hormone, which is an appetite suppressor, and it acts on the MCR4 receptor on a neuron to downstream from the POMC, and that's in the paraventricular hypothalamus. They're just communicating. So what I mean is there's communication here to tell yourself to stop eating, basically, okay? And that's what a GLP-1 let's say that L cell releases that GLP-1 in the gut, it goes and does things in the pancreas, it does things everywhere, it gets to the brain, and there's GLP-1 receptors in these POMCs, and it tells the POMC, hey, turn on. Let's stop eating here because we got enough. It's like a feedback process. But what's happening is that POMC, because of the disease state, is in an mTOR state. It's just on. It's on, and it's not able to activate that MCR4 thing I said. It's not able to release that that important aspect of what it's supposed to do, the melanocyte stimulating hormone. But GLP-1s cause that to happen because, why do they work? Because they work, again, on the mitochondria. There's mitochondria everywhere, right? And mitochondria and metabolism is in every cell and has to be in its right place with flexibility. And I won't get in, it's a little different in a neuron where mitochondria is not as active, but it's very important. But what it does is it works on making that cell in the brain now, that POMC, it puts it more in an AMPK state to balance with the mTOR state. But when we use higher doses at the beginning, we use supraphysiologic doses of GLP-1s at the beginning to suppress appetite. Okay, so that, you following me?
Yeah, for sure.
So we've got this POMC that's not functioning. It's not suppressing appetite, and so people are hungry. Well, that sets up a behavior too. It's a behavior. They can't, no matter what they do, that has become a behavior, and we can't really get into that with dopamine and so forth. But just understand that mTOR state has set them into this behavior that they cannot change. It's that significant. No matter how hard they try, it is very difficult to break out of that. But with the GLP-1, if we can suppress that appetite by now activating that that POMC, and actually at the beginning we use a super physiologic dose of the GLP-1 to really put it in that AMPK state, to really turn off any mTOR, so it's just appetite suppression. That appetite suppression is important at the beginning of this process because it is going to decrease some calorie intake. It is going to stop them from eating, but it's also what they don't know later on, and I'll bring this into play, it's going to work on rebuilding a behavior that they can now control. So we've just talked about appetite. And was that good enough to talk about that?
Yeah, that makes sense. Because I know there's also it's an interesting paper on major GABAergic effect too. So you're putting them into this more parasympathetic state associated with food too. So it's kind of that GABAergic state is a pretty appetite suppressed state to begin with in a lot of ways. I mean, it depends how far it goes, I suppose. But being in that state, I mean, that's obviously putting your brain in a position too where it's potentially more plastic and more malleable. So now that you're actually having changes occurring within your habits, you're having potential brain plasticity changes to solidify those habits. Well,
and we'll get, and again, remember, we want to make, okay, so I totally agree, and this is good. You can paraphrase some of my what I say, because sometimes I say things in too much detail and then people get lost in the woods, but this is awesome. Like, I need you with me when I'm talking to my doctors sometimes. But that you're exactly right. Can I take this one step further?
For sure.
Okay, so we've talked about appetite, and we'll come back to this again, which will be really fun. But let's talk about this other aspect of GLP-1s, and that's the slowing down of the GI tract. That's people call it the ileal brake mechanism. They call it the GI tract slows down. And people get, that's another thing where people get out of control with talking about how that's a bad thing. And that's actually, when you slow the gut down, guess what happens? Your nutrient absorption is significantly improved. Your amino acid intake, if you provide it, your minerals, vitamins, everything is better absorbed with the gut slowing down. And it's not really that the gut slows down like we think, oh, it just stops. It's not really like that. But it does slow down enough that we can, and it only makes sense that we're trying, that a GLP-1 is doing everything to not manipulate, but let the body do what it naturally does. And it only happens during that period of time that it secretes that GLP-1, right? It's slowing the gut down to do a much better job in absorbing everything it needs. Makes sense, right? So all those things are very valuable in reestablishing metabolism, because people over time, they lose the benefits of nutrient absorption because the gut's moving faster, and they're losing significant microbial diversity. And what people need to know is that GLP-1s improve microbial diversity. They improve they improve the ability of the good bugs to grow and gain more real estate versus the bad bugs that are gaining real estate when metabolism goes bad to lose real estate. That's kind of the best way to say it. And they also, by doing that, what they do is they set up this process of which people, I think, I try to let my patients understand that this diversity and this dysbiosis they maybe are not aware of that's happening is significant. The microbiome, you take all the bugs out of the gut, it's a brick. It's billions of bugs that we depend on to live with, that their metabolites are vital to our life. So in understanding that, if we just look at one particular metabolite, these short chain fatty acids like butyrate, which is a vital fatty acid for colonic health, but also what does butyrate do? It induces or activates GLP-1 release. So if you know all these things and you can use other modalities, or let's say you can use prebiotics and a butyrate supplement, you can do things to start stimulating GLP-1 natural production while you're also utilizing a GLP-1 exogenously, to change things. So what I'm saying is, the more you know about these pathways and the mechanisms of how these things work, you can use it to your advantage to end up using less of something to work better, but to also get the mechanisms in place so that when you do back down these GLP-1s, you've created the environment for success.
Totally. And it's I think where people might get a little bit confused too is like, okay, why don't I just do this with certain foods that induce GLP-1, which is a valid question, but when you start getting into it, and what I learned is, really GLP-1 is only active for a very short amount of time, right? So maybe, I don't know how familiar you are with DPP-4 inhibition and like that whole process, like naturally. Mm-hmm. Obviously, that's a way where, there's certain foods you can eat that can inhibit DPP-4 and ultimately make GLP-1 last a little bit longer. But I think the more important discussion is when you take GLP-1 exogenously, this is circulating for a longer period of time than it would ever have a chance to naturally. People are like, well, why don't I just eat more fiber? Why don't I just consume allulose? And these things are all great because they do induce GLP-1 response, but we're talking seconds, literally seconds. And if you have a system that's working and everything's attuned and you're able to have that, proper feedback mechanism to suppress the appetite, then sure, that's great. And that means the system's working and you eat and you get full and you don't want to eat anymore and everyone's hunky-dory, but most people aren't in that metabolic state. So anyway, can you...
So that's a great question. What your point is valid, but what people, I think, need to understand is if this process, if you follow what we said in the beginning of how we start losing metabolic flexibility and efficiency of the cell, well, that's the same thing that's happening in that L cell that's producing GLP-1, the same thing in the K cell that's producing GIP, and the same thing in the L cell that's also producing another peptide, PYY.
I was just going to ask about PYY. Yeah.
And so if we're losing efficiencies in that, it doesn't matter what you're doing to try to stimulate the release, that flexibility of the cell, because how does that cell work? That cell works under the same mechanisms of bringing glucose into the cell, of using all the same issues of mitochondria and glycolysis, Krebs cycle, oxidative phosphorylation. All those things are relevant to that cell. So you have to make that cell healthy too, to give its ability to come back in producing the adequate response of a GLP-1 and PYY and so forth to the induction of food that it's sensitive to.
Does GLP-1 come before neuropeptide Y, or is it the other way around? I know.
They come together. Okay. So actually, GIP comes first.
It's got inducible factor, or no? What's for GIP?
GIP is known. Boy, there are a couple different names. That's a glucogenic insulinotropic peptide, and that's in tirzepatide. That's in the second generation GLP-1, and its function is so GIP, it actually activates GLP-1 receptors, so it enhances GLP-1 release, which is kind of interesting, and it also works on modulating glucagon in the liver and gluconeogenesis when it's needed. And that's kind of the neat thing about GLP-1s, why people, we could talk about hypoglycemia and stuff, but so the GIP is up higher in the ileum and the lower part of the duodenum, and then the more the GLP-1s are like at the ileum and the colon, and the L cells they're lower. So the L cells are what release GLP-1s and PYY, and PYY is another peptide that induces that works on appetite suppression.
Got it. Yeah. So because I know they're all
insulin too,
kind of entangled there. So, and then as far as like the general kind of protocols that people follow, like a lot of times people are, you're talking about having a super physiological dose first, and then longer term, obviously kind of breaking the dose down a little bit more. At what point, or actually let's back up and just say, if someone is going to do a GLP-1, what are the important things that they continue doing, right? Like if you talk about the muscle wasting, and let's like combat some of these negative things that people talk about. Mm-hmm. Like to me, muscle wasting seems like a pretty easy thing to avoid if you're not dealing with a pre-existing condition, right? I mean, obviously stimulus is going to be probably the number one thing that you can do, right? Mm-hmm. So what are some of these things that people can do to say prevent the muscle loss, to prevent Ozempic face, so to speak? What are
Yeah, those are great questions, and I think number one that this is where I think the healthcare provider and that relationship is very important in working with somebody who has the knowledge base of using these GLP-1s and has been trained to use them too. And in answering that question, the goal always with losing weight is doing it slowly, not fast. And so there's a progression of increasing these GLP-1s over time. All GLP-1s, from my practice, is you're tailoring it to the patient because they all respond differently. And so you're trying to find that dosing where you don't go extremely high. I rarely reach the recommended dosing that they use in the papers to talk about, hey, you got to get to this number to have weight loss. No, you don't. There are people that are very sensitive to these where you just have to go so far. So number one, you've got to find out what is going to work with that patient. And on the other side, you can find that some of these GLP-1s are going to cause more gastric distress or problems with nausea, and you got to go slower, and you've got to use lower doses, or you divide them up, but you got to tailor it to the patient. So in that respect, when they've accepted the fact, hey, I'll get you there, just let's do this right, because remember, weight loss is the side effect here. We're working on metabolism, we're working on cell efficiency, because I'm going to take you further. My job is to open up this world that you don't know exists, and you'll know what I'm talking about as we get going. And that's where they come back, with increased energy and all these things they're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then where can you go with that? Well, so sometimes it's hard right at the beginning to get people, especially if they haven't been training, to get them into some type of resistance exercise. That can be difficult. Though we talk about it, you may have to just wait a little bit until you start getting some changes to get them ingrained, because you don't want to lose that. You've got to. It's all this. I have to say, it's an art in working with your patient to figure out when that timing can be right without turning them off, without pushing too much in their plate. But you make that emphasis of how strength training can be so important and why, and you go through that. But the other way to mitigate that to some degree is to, at least at the beginning, to get them on, to get their protein intake higher, with making sure they're getting leucine, enough leucine to activate that muscle protein synthesis. And it's not, and because, and it's another way to make sure that they get enough nutritional value to what they're eating. That the protein is a great way to, as long as you're not doing something like, how do I preface this? Sometimes, like if you try to get them involved in using whey or casein, and, that can be filling. That can be sometimes where they say, oh gosh, I got filled up so fast. Doc, I don't know if I can do this. So what I try to do is I try to reach this point of like 0.6 grams per pound of protein. That's kind of the minimal amount of where you can just keep people. You're not going to get any muscle building, but you're going to keep them. That's a safe number to get enough protein in them that they can do if they're not used to that. If you have people that are already in that mindset, I'd love to get them up to maybe 100 grams. That would be great, but that's not always achievable. So the 0.6 per pound has kind of been that magic number where you can get most people to do a good job and get in, they'll get in 60 grams or so. And that's tough though sometimes. So when I'm trying to work on protein, you try to work on all the right sources, right? Food sources if they can, and you try to use the whey supplement, casein whey if you can. But sometimes you'll have to kind of maybe go to the essential amino acids that have the branched chain amino acids in them, like the leucine, which is important, branched chain leucine, isoleucine, valine. The leucine's the important cell signaling agent for kind of coming in the back door to turn on mTOR a little bit and protein synthesis, right? So if it's not ideal to have them take the essential amino acids, but because there's no real nutrition with that, right? Yeah. To supplement that. We could get into all that.
No, totally get what you're saying. I mean, they're essentially filling themselves up, in a situation where they're already satiated. So it's just, exacerbated. And then they get to the point where where's the micronutrition at that point?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but there are ways to get some things started. So that's the struggle you go through, but at least the patient knows what you're working for. And if you do it slow, and another thing too is hydration. We didn't talk about. Hydration is crucial with this process of using the GLP-1s, and a lot of time people that get those bone density studies, depending how they're getting them done, they don't show the real values because they're dehydrated, and that's a huge mismatch right there. But hydration is so important also.
Especially when there's fat cell turnover, hydration becomes even more important.
Huge.
People don't realize that. That's because you sound like a woo-woo witch doctor person when you start talking about hydration and fat loss. And the fact of the matter is that there's also a saline gradient that actually comes into play too. There's all these different things that kind of happen in terms of just osmosis and everything like that actually not only increases fat loss, but as you are having fat turnover, if you're not hydrating, then everything's cattywampus.
Well, and people don't understand that hydration is the key. The cell, when the cell is at its optimal size, it's in its best metabolic state it can be. Yep. So all this stuff you're working on,
more surface area for actual like absorption and everything. Yep.
All the signaling we're trying to work on, everything we're trying to do, and in fact, a cell at its fullest, fully hydrated, is it inhibits significant viral replication. I mean, there's so many implications of cell hydration that we could go on. But
no, I know, I'm with you, man. And I don't want to. We could go on forever. And one thing I just want to tack onto the end of this one is, this is where I feel like it's important having a doc that knows what they're talking about, because there's other things, we didn't even talk about in this video, secretagogues and things like that can be added in addition to the GLP-1s to help muscle preservation, right?
Sure.
So it's like, not that, and I understand like GLP-1 can be a gateway for a lot of people. It's like, okay, well now I'm interested. Now I want to build muscle. Now I'm interested in GHRPs, and the whole Pandora's box of peptides opens up. And I think in my personal opinion, my personal experience, sometimes looking at peptides is, you're working with your body's own systems versus something exogenous, like people would think. And it is exogenous in the sense that you're taking it from outside in, but you're working with your body's own systems and processes compared to, say, adding something completely foreign to try to induce a response, right?
Correct.
So I think that's where the negative bias, and I don't even think it's a negative bias anymore. I think we are in an interesting time where people are exceptionally receptive and open to the world of peptide science and how that's working. So people like yourself that are doing amazing work and are actually educated in this. And I think it's a little dangerous sometimes when there's docs that don't really know what they're doing, that are just jumping on the bandwagon. And I get it. People have interest, but there's an education that has to come with this.
Yeah, that opens a whole nother area of you're right on target. It's so when I started this peptide education long time ago, it was really meant to introduce physicians to cellular medicine. It was a way to talk about molecular pathways and how we could work with some of the things we just talked about. I never knew it would turn into this process of where it is today, with how peptides have like taken over the world, but it's great. It's engaged people, right? It's gotten us to this to a place where people want to be more informed, and
they want to learn. They want to learn about mechanisms, which is what.
Yes.
And I understand. I'm all for evidence. I am, but like sometimes the evidence-based community, and I say that with quotes, is focused so on the observational or the reverse causation BS that ends up out there, that sometimes I feel like the regular person needs to get excited about mechanisms, because I feel like the regular person wants to know a why, even though you can get bashed for talking mechanisms. Like, people I find are interested in that. And when you start opening the box of peptides, people start being interested in the mechanisms. And when they're interested in the mechanisms, then they're interested in, well, what can I do to improve this mechanism?
Right.
Oh, wow, this is cool. This is a lot more like a performance car than I thought it was. And I can like tweak these things and I can help the body do this. And I just find that it gets people excited in a way that other things, that simple calories in, calories out doesn't get people excited about, right? It's like you've got to spark something with people. And that's what's interesting. I mean, at least for me.
Yeah. And that's, how can you, if you don't know the mechanisms, if you don't know the pathways, well, then how can you get to any place how can you treat any problem if you don't know how a cell normally works? And we have all of this, we have so much data on exercise and diet and how it influences a cell and all of those mechanisms that are important in every aspect of improving the cell health. And if you know those pathways and you realize the importance of every aspect of diet and sleep and exercise, whether it's aerobic, HIIT, or resistance, then imagine where you can take that knowledge into metabolic problems, immune problems, disease states, because they're the same pathways that go wrong.
Yep. Yeah.
I'm
with you.
That's what makes it so much fun, because the pathways never lie. Pathways are never changing. Pathways are going to be here forever. If you know, so that's why I get so bent out of shape with people out there selling all of these tests on, you need to have this methylation test, you need to have this epigenetic test, you need to have this DNA test.
You're the third doc in a row, literally sitting in that chair in a row that has said the same thing. Docs, like scientists being like, methylation test, epigenetic test, biological age, like you don't need all these tests.
Well, some of it's good. Some of it can be used. It depends on how you're using it. I just think in a general sense, I think people are just, I think you have to be careful. You have to know, before you get into all of that, and is it going to really change what you do?
Yeah.
Your objective is to do what? Our objective with every patient is to make the cell more flexible and more efficient.
Yep.
If we're doing that, we're doing everything.
Exactly, man. All right. So Dr. Seeds, where can everyone find you, man?
You can find us on the ssrpinstitute.org, or I have my Redox Medical Group practice based in Beverly Hills. Okay.
Yeah, and I'll link out to all your social channels and your Instagram, Facebook, all that stuff down below.
Awesome.
Thanks, Doc.
All right, you bet. Thank you.